Our first panel member is John Kostyack. He's Executive Director of the National Whistleblower Center. Before arriving at the National Whistleblower Center, John served for 4.5 years as Executive Director of the Wind Solar Alliance. And from 1994 to 2014, he was at the National Wildlife Federation in a variety of roles, culminating in his role as Vice President of Wildlife Conservation, where he managed NWS wildlife and habitat conservation efforts. With that, I'll turn the floor over to you, John.
Thank you, Lee, and thanks to my friends at Environmental Law Institute and INECE for co-sponsoring this series of webinars with the National Whistleblower Center. For those who don't know the National Whistleblower Center, we are a 31-year-old nonprofit based here in Washington, D.C., protects people and the environment from corruption by doing 3 things: providing legal assistance. Let me just get to the right slide here. There you go. Providing legal assistance to whistleblowers, strengthening whistleblower policy, and educating the public about the benefits of whistleblowers. And today's topic is really right in our wheelhouse. We're all about helping everyday citizens and very much like to help citizens protect their environment. So this will give you a little bit of a preview of what I hope to talk about today. I want to start with the critically endangered porpoise known as the Vaquita. It's really a fitting symbol of what we're up against. The forces that are driving this beautiful animal to extinction in its home in the Gulf of California are the same forces that are driving much of the environmental devastation around the world. And those are the forces of crime. One of the biggest environmental problems we have is that environmental crime is highly profitable, especially when there is an absence of meaningful law enforcement. Here, the crime is that of blanketing the Gulf of Mexico with fishing nets and trafficking in the totoba, which is a fish whose bladder is greatly prized in the Chinese medicinal market, and therefore it is an extremely lucrative business. So the key point I want to make is that many of the tools that we in the conservation community know about don't really work in this context. Persuasion, economic incentives. This is the world of conservation for many people. But for gangsters like this guy right here, the Mexican cartel leader, Oscar Parra, whose cartel has been devastating the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of California with fishing nets, persuasion, economic incentives are meaningless. They won't stop folks like him. They won't stop folks who commit crimes from corporate suites, the ones who wear the suits and every day and carry out corrupt activities on behalf of certain multinational companies. So the question for us to think about today is, have we used every tool in our arsenal for pursuing these criminals? And a little bit of a preview, we're not just talking here about environmental crime. And therefore, we shouldn't just be talking about enforcing environmental laws. Parra was ultimately thrown in jail for murder, not illegal fishing. So this is an area of the Amazon rainforest under serious pressure from ranching and farming. Many people believe that the best hope for keeping this forest intact and rescuing our global climate and providing many important services to local communities is to engage rubber tappers and others who are focused on sustainable extractive uses. But here's the problem. Low impact activities like this are increasingly impractical because the local residents say, this is not me saying, local residents say they're being terrorized by criminals. Rubber tappers cannot survive if criminals are leveling their forests, just like subsistence fishermen and women cannot survive in Mexico if criminals are destroying the fisheries. Many of you might know this gentleman, Chico Mendes, the rubber tapper and lands rights activist who really conceived of the idea of an extractive reserve. He's a whistleblower and a hero who paid with his life for his advocacy. Assassinated by a rancher in 1988, the rancher was essentially trying to shut down the movement that Chico launched. Well, fortunately, the movement continues. But the question I want to ask today is, have we learned how to provide better support and security for our environmental heroes? So there are a lot of choices here about where to focus. My organization right now is focusing on 4 areas of environmental work because they are rife with corruption and very much in need of aggressive law enforcement. Let me just give a couple of numbers to put these problems in context. 20% of our wild-caught ocean fish are estimated to be illegally caught. That is a lot of fish. 10 to 30% of the global wood trade is estimated to be comprised of illegally harvested forest products. So let's say we all agree it's time to give greater focus to crime in our environmental work. Where to begin? Well, I would say I tend to look at most environmental issues from a global perspective, and I would strongly encourage us all to think about how to increase international cooperation. But international laws, that's a different story. They don't provide enforcement tools. So we need domestic criminal laws and civil penalties, particularly those that have a track record, the ones that are already working. The good news is the United States has a host of laws that are indeed successful in this area. And this includes laws that are designed to address global problems, such as the Endangered Species Act, a law I've spent a fair amount of my career working on, enforces the CITES Convention on wildlife trafficking, and the Act to Prevent Pollution from Ships, which enforces the MARPOL Convention. Now, the natural starting place for many people in the environmental community is the so-called citizen suit provisions. In fact, if I were to tell people I was giving a talk about citizen enforcement, oh, you're going to talk about the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, citizen suit provisions. And the answer is no, that's not what I'm here to talk about. I love these laws. I used to enforce them in a prior life, but they will only play a small role, in my view, in tackling the big global challenges we face. They focus mainly on environmental injuries experienced inside the United States. And they're really not designed to help build criminal cases. Only occasionally in these cases do the plaintiffs even ally themselves with the government to prosecute. Usually the government is the defendant. And even then, when there is the environmentalists lining up with the government, there's no incentives really for the citizen environmentalists to cooperate with the government in building a case. Let's talk in contrast about whistleblower laws. Key feature of the key TAM whistleblower laws is that exact incentive I was alluding to. Citizens are incentivized with financial rewards to cooperate with the government in building cases. Lacey Act, Endangered Species Act. Under those laws, whistleblowers receive rewards from Interior Department, Commerce Department, Agricultural Department for helping tackle illegal trafficking in wildlife, fish, and plants. Act to Prevent Pollution from Ships. Rewards from the Coast Guard for bringing forward evidence of illegal discharges from ocean vessels. The Whistleblower Center is involved in enforcing these environmental laws. We're also involved in this second body of laws, False Claims Act, Dodd-Frank Act, host of non-environmental laws, and we're using them to pursue environmental goals. I'm going to get back to those non-environmental laws in a moment. Let me just show a couple pictures. Carnival Cruise lines. I don't know if you've all been reading the news about Carnival Cruise lines lately. They just settled a second criminal case, very much similar to the first criminal case, rampant dumping in our oceans and coastal waters. This case was developed thanks to the cooperation and help of whistleblowers. $60 million penalty is now accumulated. Let's hope that begins to change the corporate culture. If not, we'll go in again. But that's just a classic case of how whistleblowers can truly make a difference. Whistleblowers helped put this case together. It was smuggling of Jaguars out of Mexico into the United States, ultimately, presumably to serve Asian market. There's status symbols, apparently, of the fangs and the furs. But this was a very significant case that only came about thanks to whistleblowers who were rewarded. All right, I want to focus my attention on some of these non-environmental laws. Let me just focus primarily on the False Claims Act. There's a whole bunch of environmental laws, non-environmental laws that we could talk about, but due to the limits of time, let me just give a little bit of focus to what I would consider to be the most important, many people say is the most important of the whistleblower laws. And here's why. I'm not going to read all those bullets for you. Hopefully you'll have a chance to take a look at them in your own time. But what I want to focus on is the fact, well, first of all, this law has been around a long time, so we have a lot of great experience with it. Originally signed by Abraham Lincoln, modernized in 1986. So we have a nice track record to look at. And what we have learned is that the government loves these cases. And that's really important for building cases. You want support from law enforcement officials. And they love these cases because it has treble damages. And that produces big penalties for criminals and big returns for taxpayers. Whistleblowers love this law. They can file a case confidentially under seal. The government will often do the heavy lifting, essentially all the work on the litigation. And then there's that mandatory reward. 15 to 30% of the government's recovery goes back to the whistleblower. This gives you a flavor of some of the numbers we're talking about. $42 billion to the US Treasury thanks to whistleblower cases. And that's 6.4 billion with a B into the pockets of whistleblowers, thanks to their helping build these cases. All right, let's talk about how we might use this law for our environmental purposes, getting citizens engaged. There are two types of cases. One, where the corrupt individual or company collects money from the government that was not properly earned. And that's really what gave rise to the original law back in Civil War times. Civil War contractors were bilking the government. But then there's the reverse False Claims Act case. And that's where someone withholds money from the government that should have been paid. That covers a lot of potential environmental wrongdoing, including, for example, misleading statements made by an oil and gas company in its application for use of our public lands or waters. Or false custom declarations by a seafood company or a wood products company. So the Whistleblower Center has an important wildlife case filed under seal using this reverse False Claims Act approach. You might remember this big environmental case known as the Deepwater Horizon, $20 billion settlement, record recovery. Well, there was in that case a False Claims Act claim made by the government. It was actually a whistleblower center that alerted the government there were some significant False Claims Act violations. To give you a flavor, BP said it had relied on a top wildlife expert when it prepared its response plan. It failed to mention that expert had died 4 years before the preparation of that response plan, the submission of that response plan. So there was a bunch of misrepresentations about safety and emergency response procedures that enabled the government to use the False Claims Act as part of its arsenal in that case against BP, and as part of the criminal settlement. Let's look at this from the NGO perspective. You're an NGO, you want to get involved in whistleblower work. We really recommend thinking about this from a strategic communications perspective. Let's talk first about behind the scenes communications. Non-governmental organizations often have deep roots in communities where the witnesses to crimes reside. Oftentimes they'll have strong relationships with law enforcement officials. Both of these play a critical role, enable the NGO to serve as a bridge to prosecutors as well as private attorneys who represent whistleblowers, and facilitating that critical behind the scenes communications. And we'll talk more about what that might look like from a technology perspective, I hope, today. But NGOs can also help with public communications, whether it's playing up the revenue benefits of a prosecution. Oftentimes these cases have big national security implications. We were just talking before we got started about the linkages between wildlife trafficking and trafficking in wood products and terrorism and human rights violations. So there's a lot of work to be done to build support for these cases, both among the prosecutors to motivate law enforcement officials to proceed and think big, think much bigger than they have been up till now, as well as to the policymakers whose support we need to keep these laws intact, as well as to continue strengthening these laws. And I would also emphasize, and I know as a lawyer this sounds self-serving, biased, NGOs should be connecting whistleblowers with qualified attorneys, because navigating through these cases is not a simple matter. This is a specialized area of law, not well suited at all for whistleblowers to take a go-it-alone approach. It's something that the Whistleblower Center puts a lot of effort into. We have a confidential legal intake system. If you go to our website, click on Stop Fraud, you'll get a sense of what that looks like. Another thing that NGOs and all of us should be involved is educating whistleblowers. We know we cannot completely eliminate the risk of stepping forward with evidence of environmental crimes, but we also know there's much more we could be doing on minimizing that risk. Any decision on whether to step forward should include a discussion of risk minimization, and that includes how to maintain confidentiality and anonymity, and how to ensure secure communications. This is often not part of the public conversation, because the cases you know most about are the people who have decided to go public and are really not putting a lot of work into protecting themselves and leaving themselves pretty exposed. There are other ways to go to become a whistleblower, and that is to protect your anonymity. Now, that's not consistently the case in implementing whistleblower laws. For example, the False Claims Act says that you can file the case under seal, remain anonymous, and the government will take a look at the case and decide whether or not to intervene. And if it decides to intervene, you remain anonymous, and they take over all the litigation, and you get rewarded for your contribution. Some of those contributions can be continuous throughout the course of the case. You remain anonymous, you can stay inside your company and deliver evidence to the government. But if the government elects not to pursue the case, you also have the option of proceeding on your own, and that requires disclosing your identity. So there's the complexities there of how to maintain confidentiality and anonymity. Some of these other laws, there's no provision for the whistleblower to proceed on their own. So they can stay confidential, anonymous the entire time, and the government decides whether to proceed. Another key area of risk that we need to do better in educating whistleblowers about is timeliness. Some of these whistleblower laws have first to file requirements. And so if you sit on your hands, somebody else could come in and maybe even take the information you gather and deliver it to the government and disqualify you from your reward. So a lot of fine points that require work from all of us to help whistleblowers proceed. Now, we are an organization whose core mission is helping whistleblowers. So I would really like to close here with a strong message about the importance of protecting whistleblowers. We talked earlier about Chico Mendes' death. We all know that this is a serious concern around the world, including in this country, but especially in countries with poor governance and poor law enforcement systems. There's no more important thing that we can do to show our support for whistleblowers is to educate them and ourselves about best practices, to keeping them safe from retaliation to the greatest degree possible. And that means using the attorney-client privilege wherever possible. It means taking advantage of encryption technology for any communications, thinking really carefully about how and whether to pursue your case through the media. Our view is that public disclosure should happen, but only if the whistleblower has given informed consent with full awareness of the risks and how to minimize them. Again, lives and livelihoods are often at stake. So I just want to wrap up and thank you all for listening. This is a really exciting time. Hope to keep all of you involved. We have a website we encourage you to go to. If you come to that section of our website, you can take action or at least stay engaged with our legal and policy programs. You can also order the Whistleblowers Handbook, written by Whistleblower Center founder and board chairman, Steve Cohn. This is really well written, despite being fairly thick. It's quite an easy read. I think it's really clearly written, and more importantly, these are the tools that we all need. So come to our website, get the books, get on our list, go to Facebook, go to Twitter, stay connected with us. Let's continue this conversation.